two of my friends are presenting today. Ayesha could not make it. We will still go for about 20 minutes, if that's okay, and then that would be followed by discussants. I'll discuss Sultan's paper and then Asma as well. Maybe we'll start with you. And then we'll open the floor for Q&A. So Sultan, over to you. He's going to present on social movements and dictatorship evidence from Pakistan's lawyers movement. Sultan.
Okay, so thanks for coming to my session. So this paper is something I've been working on quite recently, but I wanted to work on it for a long time. And this was to understand the Pakistan lawyers movement and trying to learn something on the future of democracy in Pakistan from this movement. So remember this guy. For those of us who are not undergrads and are old, this was our invincible General Musharraf, who I naively thought when I was young that he is going to be the dictator till the end of my days. But you have this iconic picture of General Musharraf, who basically, just before his impeachment was going to begin, where he fell from grace and power. So this shows up in the data as well. So if you look at the IRI poll, a poll conducted by the Republican Institute, you observe that General Musharraf went very, very quickly from about above 60% approval ratings to less than 20% approval rating. So what happened? That's the key question I set out to answer. Now, one common theory is that it was the lawyers' movement which weakened General Musharraf. And when we ask the lawyers' movement, and if we want to empirically investigate the effect of lawyers' movement, we have to be more specific. We have to ask very specific questions that did the lawyers' movement bring down dictatorship in Pakistan? Who gained the most politically from the lawyers' movement? And who were the people who lost politically the most? So who were the winners and the losers? A typical question which we economists are very interested to think about. So the key empirical issue is that it is very challenging to distinguish the effect of lawyers' movement on, say, voting of PMLQ, which General Musharraf was being supported by, because there were many other things which were happening at the same time. So, for example, you have the Benazir-Musharraf negotiations going on at the same time at the lawyers' movement. And this resulted in the now infamous, the NRO, which has become an abuse now. So the National Reconciliation Ordinance, which was deeply unpopular, especially within the military elite. You had other things going on, like the Lal Masjid standoff, where a group of clerics got together and had a standoff in the Lal Masjid, the Red Mosque, and eventually there was a military operation, which many believe also deeply made General Musharraf unpopular. So it could be, of course, all of these factors mattered, but does it mean that these factors were the only factors which mattered and the lawyers' movement was just riding on this? That's the key empirical challenge which we have to address. And empirically, the issue we face is we need the lawyers' movement to vary within the country, because all of these are national events, but so was the lawyers' movement. The lawyers' movement was a national movement. It was not varying within Pakistan, so we cannot look at districts or constituencies in Pakistan which had more intense lawyers' movement versus less intense lawyers' movement. So what do? You need this variation. So I use the variation I use is Chief Justice Iftikhar Muhammad Chaudhry's caravan as he went through the streets on the road and visited different districts and see how this affected electoral outcomes. So what I do is I look at districts where the Chief Justice visited relative to the districts which the Chief Justice didn't visited, using it as a proxy for the intensity of the lawyers' movement. Now, some places he visited many times, 12 times, and some visited only 1 or 2 times. Now, the key, now you might think this is easy, but for empirical people, it's never so easy, because the districts with the Chief Justice visited and the districts with the Chief Justice didn't visit are not apples to apples comparisons. The districts where the Chief Justice visited, those districts might already have Musharraf very unpopular, or the PMLQ, for instance, is very unpopular there. So these are not apples to apples comparisons. Comparing districts where the Chief Justice visited versus districts where the Chief Justice didn't visited are apples to oranges. Now, to overcome this challenge, I propose a new identification strategy, and that is the use of incidental visits. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, what was the Chief Justice doing when he was visiting? He was going to address the bar associations, and his route plan was public in the newspaper. So, for example, when the Chief Justice was going from Sakhar to Hyderabad Bar Association, this was most likely strategic but all the way when he, for example, passed through Larkana, Moro, Khairpur, these were districts which happened to be in the way. So what we can do is we can just drop the districts which are planned or strategic and just look at those districts which happen to be on the way. So just to illustrate, for example, when the Chief Justice on 14th March 2007 was going to Sakhar to Hyderabad, he stopped to address in Moro, Khairpur, Larkana, Nawabshah, and Matiari. And these are basically, we skip all of these and only focus on this quasi-random visits which just happen to be on the way. And what do we find out when we do that? We can actually, okay, this equation, let's ignore this, but yeah, this is the equation we estimate. But just what do we find out when we estimate this? We do a simple difference and differences estimator. When we look at incidental visits, we find the districts which were visited and districts which were not visited, the vote share of PMLQ there before the lawyers' movement is rather stable. What is happening here is that actually, because the lawyers' movement didn't happen yet, what we are observing is that actually these districts had no effect on, because the CJ is going to visit there. He hasn't visited there. But when we look at the CJ visited, we find that the PMLQ vote shares falls sharply. From, say, 30% to 25% can be attributed only to the lawyers' movement or the CJ visits, to be very specific. Now, who were the winners? Of course, the PMLN, which was basically, they did an oath to all their MNAs in a public signal where they said that will you support the lawyers' movement? Will you restore the Chief Justice if we get into power? They said yes. So these are so if you see the CJ visited districts are much higher for the PMLQ. So is this story as simple as basically the lawyers' movement increased the voting of opposition and decreased the votes for the government parties? Was this just opposition versus government effect? All the opposition parties gained because it was just an anti-government movement? Well, not precisely. If you look at the Pakistan People's Party, which was doing, say, negotiations with General Musharraf at the same time, if you look at the difference and differences, which is basically this subtracted this subtracted this, what we observe is that the PPP actually lost votes in places where the Chief Justice visited, which is basically saying we can look at it more precisely if we do a difference and differences. We see, okay, the CJ visit increases vote share by PMLN by 0.2 standard deviations. It decreases somewhat for PMLQ about 0.10 standard deviation. And for PPP, the CJ visited decreases the vote share the most by about 0.2 standard deviations. So, so basically, what we are observing is that the Pakistan People's Party appears to be affected negatively by the lawyers' movement. So we can do, I did a simple within estimation or a difference and differences. We can do more fancy methods like the quantile regression. We actually, so what benefit does it have for us? Well, it basically allows us to look at effect of lawyers' movement on districts with different populations. So for example, these are like the small population Kasbas. These are like Lahore, Faisalabad, Gujranwala. And we see the effect of lawyers' movement is largest in the biggest cities. And the gain, so the PMLN votes gain the most. Same thing for PMLQ, they lose the most in the largest areas. And PPP has a very interesting effect of lawyers' movement. They seem to lose in, like, say, populations with about 0.20 percentile of the distribution. So small cities, in largely actually these are places in Punjab, South Punjab, and very large cities as well. So they are losing more in a more sophisticated and a nuanced way. So finally, before I conclude, I want to get to another question, which is all probably on everybody else's mind. But what about rigging? Should we trust these elections at all? They were held under dictatorship, 2002 and 2008. So actually, we have different methods to detect rigging, and what we find is that the weird votes which happened is actually the rigging happens in favor of the PMLQ. So for example, rigging happened mostly in Balochistan and in Sindh, and mostly in favor of PMLQ. So even if we take out the rigging effect, we actually find a larger effect than we have observed, and which I've shown you. You can actually look at this graph, which is interesting. It's basically plots the turnout in a constituency with vote share. If you see, if your turnout increases, your votes should also increase. But something weird happens for PMLQ. If their turnout increases, their votes increases too much, suggesting something fishy. So of course, we cannot observe rigging directly easily from the data, but we can use the data to infer rigging. You can actually, there is another interesting number which I want to show you. Actually, the lawyers' movement appear to also reduce rigging. So places where the Chief Justice went, probably it created pressure to have more fair elections. And there you see that the number of rejected votes, which shouldn't be correlated with anything, these are just people who have not stamped it correctly, the number of rejected votes falls after the CJ visit. And what is interesting is the CJ visit, on average, increases votes for a political party by 3,000 votes. So if you can actually, the political parties can use this number, which I've calculated. If CJ visited you once, you can get 3,000 more votes. So I will skip this agenda setting mechanism. This is a bit more too much detail. So I want to leave you with more questions than answers. And I think the discussion which I hope to instigate here is that, did General Musharraf, was he the real loser of the lawyers' movement? Or was it the People's Party? Was the People's Party the real loser for its cooperation with General Musharraf? And thirdly, what does it say about the future of democracy in Pakistan? And I finish with a very provocative question, does the PDM's support of with the military elite bode well or augur well for the PDM in the next elections? Because the last time we saw, this wasn't very, very good for the PPP at least. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Umair, before I invite you, could you perhaps, Sultan, restate your overall hypothesis and findings for some of our attendees who joined late because of after the lunch break, very quickly, so that they are included in Q&A session.
So in a nutshell, what I find is that lawyers' movement impacted voting in Pakistan. the politics of Pakistan, the PMLQ loses, the PMLN gains, but also the Pakistan People's Party loses. And in addition, the lawyers' movement reduced the probability of rigging going on in an election. The number of rejected votes decreases where the Chief Justice went. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Great. Umair, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Umair Javed. I teach sociology here at LUMS. My paper is part of a sort of larger project that was carried out between 2019 and 2021, exploring the impact of energy-related protests on empowerment and accountability in contexts that are usually characterized as fragile and conflict-affected. So we were looking at Pakistan, Nigeria, and Mozambique. So me and my colleagues, we were doing a sort of cross-country comparison and attempting to sort of create a better understanding of how struggles over energy access, energy pricing in particular, impact democratization and basic variables around accountability and empowerment. So in some ways, my work dovetails nicely with what Sultan just presented, but is probably a little less optimistic in terms of the impact of mobilization on accountability and empowerment-related metrics. But my methods, obviously, I'm a qualitative researcher, so the methods differ considerably. So the motivation for this work was mostly an observation of an uptick in what we characterize as energy-related contention, especially between the periods 2005 and 2015. There are energy-related protests that take place in over 100 countries during this time period, conditioned by a number of factors which we'll get into. And these mass protests have the impact of shaping how energy sector reform is carried out. When I'm using the term energy here, I mean both electricity, which is what I was looking at for Pakistan, and then my co-researchers were looking at things like fuel pricing in a context such as Nigeria and Mozambique. But we were covering both fuel and electricity over the course of our research. There's very little work on fuel and electricity-related riots. Unlike food riots, which have a long and illustrious history of being documented, from E.P. Thompson's work in the 1960s to Charles Tilly's work, there is very little work that looks specifically at how fuel and electricity riots condition democratization and political participation. And why we think that this is interesting and relevant for our context, especially in the 21st century, is that energy or access to energy, electricity, fuel, has become a non-negotiable good. It's something that citizens actively seek. It is something that citizens actively mobilize around. So we fall in within the larger moral economy framework, where we consider electricity and energy more broadly to be so central to everyday life that it is seen as a right rather than a commodity. This has not historically or conventionally been the case, but given, obviously, transformations, globalization, modernization, the entrenchment of capitalism, energy has been reinvented, especially after the end of the Second World War, and decolonization. Energy has been put forward as a national developmental ambition for most states around the world. And so imagery of dams being built are so closely intertwined with what our vision of development actually looks like. So we're using essentially energy to study state-society relations, especially in contexts such as Pakistan. So we were motivated by some very simple and largely sort of descriptive questions, which were, do struggles over energy empower people to hold public authorities accountable? We were interested in understanding how the political context in particular shapes the interaction between the state and energy-related protests, or electricity protests in particular for Pakistan's case. We've asked, have popular struggles over energy strengthened accountability for energy, and especially for decision making around energy? And do struggles over energy empower people to take more control over energy policy? So the two words or two terms that we're looking at, accountability and empowerment. Accountability rests largely on the ability to hold the state account for service delivery, whereas empowerment means greater involvement in the way that policies and decision making is being carried out in the particular sector that we're looking at. Here's a timeline of the key events that we're looking at for our case in Pakistan. So 1992 to 94, we have the infamous power sector reforms, where we see the introduction of independent private producers. We have a second IPP policy in 2001. Between 2007 and 8, we experienced the first major oil price shock of this millennium, which is closely tied, obviously, to the global financial crisis as well. And it raises the cost of generation. So Pakistan, which is largely dependent on imported fuel, or was at the time, for its electricity needs, suffers a supply shock, considerable supply shock, which raises the cost of generation. In 2008, the People's Party government wins national election on the back of massive discontentment with the General Musharraf's regime. Between 2009 and 2012, we have a prolonged, we obviously have a period, for those of you who've lived through it, load shedding was sort of a standout feature of our existence at that time. It led to 322 protests. The PMLN wins a national election on a mandate to end electricity shortages. And for an initial 2 years, the protests continue as the PMLN government struggles to sort of cope with the crisis. Between 2014 and 18, we see an oil price reduction, which reduces the cost of generation, and also a massive increase in generation capacity due to Chinese investment of about $33 billion. So installed capacity goes up by over 60% during this time period. In 2018, PTI wins the national election on, for a number of other reasons. And on 2020, for the first time, there is a sort of a political review of the IPP policy with a view of understanding how contracts have been negotiated and the impact that it has on the pricing of electricity that is available for citizens. So this is a sort of text-heavy slide where I'm just sort of summarizing the overall argument of my paper. And basically, the key point that I wanted to raise here is that in the aftermath of what we see, where load shedding is 14 hours per day, we see 456 incidents of contention. These include protests, mobilization, riots, a number of sort of contentious episodes, with about 30% escalating into some form of violence. And most of the violence is directed towards distribution company offices. This time period, sees electricity becoming the #1 political issue in the country. And that is partly that what also explains the victory of the PMLN in the 2013 elections. And so there is extensive investment to expand generation capacity and ensure consistency in supply. But the key point is, while evading questions about affordability and sustainability of the electricity sector. And this is the point that I want to focus on for this paper as well, that why do we see a massive increase in investment as far as supply is concerned, right? And a new sort of state-society guarantee on the existence of electricity as far as when you switch on the light, something will turn on, but not enough of a political conversation on how do you make this more affordable and sustainable. And so on the surface, this case of extensive investment in generation suggests that the protests did work and the government became more responsive to the concerns of citizens at large. But in reality, what it shows is that there were a range of factors that conditioned investment in supply, specifically the organizational nature of those who were impacted by the crisis, who was most affected, who mobilized most extensively, who had direct access to politicians and policymakers and could get their agenda on the table, versus those who could not. And specifically, obviously, the pressures that were imposed by private media, opposition political parties, and so on. So on the other hand, what we see is that citizen inclusion and participation in decision-making and issues of affordability and sustainability, which end up impacting the most vulnerable and disempowered groups the most, remain absent from the political and policy conversation around energy. This suggests that while protests were useful in generating a short-term response, which prioritized increase in supply, it ignored the long-term legacy of greater empowerment for marginalized groups who obviously are more concerned with questions of affordability and sustainability. Again, just some quick facts about Pakistan's electricity sector. I want to sort of focus on a couple of things here in particular. The first is obviously the major generation sources, of which RLNG gas are now sort of obviously dominant, but coal and RFO are also reasonably important. Generation is largely in private hands, with 60% of all generation being done by private producers. There are obviously a range of other factors, such as countrywide system losses. Ijlal, for example, covered this in his presentation yesterday. And there's significant variation in the kind of losses that we see in the system throughout. The crisis that we all lived through obviously received considerable international coverage. This was something that dominated the conversation around Pakistan, this and terrorism being the two sort of key characteristics of the conversation around Pakistan for much of the early 2000s up till 2014, 2015. The methods that I used were the first and sort of primary source of data that we had was an events catalog, where we categorized all protest incidents that took place between 2005 and 2015. And we sort of were able to filter out energy-related protests, and were able to characterize them on the basis of the occupation of protesters, who was organizing, the kind of, whether they were violent or not, who was being targeted in those protests, and so on. We also were able to carry out focus group discussions in a number of areas that saw repeated mobilization around electricity. So these included low-income neighborhoods in Lahore, Kot Lakhpat and Chungi Amar Sidhu, and then a site in Kamalia, which was the site of one of the most violent electricity riots that took place in 2012. We also carried out sort of community-based key informant interviews with people who had participated in electricity protests. And then finally, we did a number of key informant interviews with policy elites, politicians, former ministers, decision makers with transnational and multilateral donors in particular. So this was sort of some brief statistics from our events catalog. We see that the total number of protests that we covered was 486, but the bulk of those fall between 2007 and 2015. It's very clear that protests rise as the temperature goes up. We see more protests taking place in the summer months. This, for us, was probably one of the key findings from the events catalog, which was the occupation of protesters. A lot of the protests were led by political parties, opposition political parties at the time. But one key group from within society that was very active were business associations led by traders and in particular industrial. In fact, what we found was that the largest protests, both in terms of the number of participants as well as the duration of the protest that was taking place, were those that were led by upper income groups, so specifically traders, industrialists, politicians in particular. Most of the protests took place were non-violent in nature, but we had a significant 30% that turned violent. The violence was largely directed towards distribution company offices, and that's where a lot of the damage to property and in some cases damage to life also took place. The spread in terms of urban and rural was fairly straightforward. We had obviously, as we expect, we would see greater protests in urban areas, but there were quite a few that happened in rural or peri-urban areas as well. So what were some of the key things that we found from our focus group discussions and community key informant interviews? Well, the first thing is that, again, the moral economy of electricity dominates, that affordable electricity supply is viewed as a fundamental right, with the term haq that is frequently used to depict what this particular relationship with energy is. There is very little knowledge or very little interest in knowing how the sector actually works. This is true for most people. We're not interested in how our electricity is produced, as long as it's produced as long as we get it, and as long as we don't have to pay through the nose for it. That seems to be the dominant perception that we receive from the community as well. The guarantee of electricity supply is seen as a government obligation, which again fits well into this idea of electricity being a right rather than it being a commodity, and a considerable degree of helplessness on pricing and payment. And so the argument was that people receive subsidies for everything from sugarcane, sugar mill owners, and all sorts of businesses receive subsidies, but poor people are oftentimes not considered or not thought of as eligible for the same subsidies in reducing electricity prices in particular. And public protest was largely taken as a course of action when no other choice was left. And protests did work for immediate issues, so solving immediate supply-related constraints or infrastructure-related problems. कि अगर transformer जल गया तो आप उसको restore करवा दें. But these were largely temporary fixes, and they had very little sort of long-term impact. But you see a very different picture when you start to speak to policymakers and elites who are largely governing the sector, right? The first thing that comes out is, again, the consensus that electricity supply is now a non-negotiable, is politically non-negotiable, right? And people consider voter pressure in particular to be immense, especially since the 2008 to 2015 crisis. But whose pressure is what actually matters? And when you start probing our informants here, it comes out that the people that they are most likely to listen to are members of the business community, industrialists, and especially residents of middle and upper middle class neighborhoods. Those are the people that are most greatly in contact with politicians, and they're the ones whose voice, as far as energy-related decision-making is concerned, is also going to be heard. And then a slightly different picture emerges when you speak to policy practitioners. So these are the technocrats who are advising ministers and advising the government. And for them, the question is essentially that our framework for reform has to mainstream the idea of electricity as a commodity rather than as a right. So it becomes a key source of contention. Now you see that the citizens, which views electricity as a right, versus policy practitioners who want to sort of re-envision electricity as a commodity because they think that the sustainability of the sector is built on exactly that fact. And so there's a common or sort of dominant theme that public sector distribution is beyond repair and privatization remains the only hope for improved governance. The outcome of this particular perception or set of perceptions at the level of elite decision makers is that there is no clear framework for improving accountability and citizen voice in power sector management. So on key metrics of both accountability and empowerment, we see that the way that the decision-making is structured in the sector, that really doesn't have any space for these issues to be discussed. Now, what explains the way that Pakistan responded to the electricity crisis? Well, it's quite clear that Pakistan, with its long legacy of authoritarianism, limited space for civil society and political parties that are largely deinstitutionalized, would end up prioritizing clientelistic linkages with voters, which is why we see that voters which belong to upper income groups were more salient in the decision making around electricity and the response to electricity crisis. There is obviously a weak economy, that's a structural factor that no one set of decision makers could do anything about in the immediate run. But also that governance of the energy sector is so heavily bureaucratized that there are very few institutional channels for regular citizens to actually approach decision makers and get their viewpoints across. And so what we see is that poor populations are unable to pay for costly energy, and they have very little recourse to actually having a voice in the way that the system is run as well. So what did the protests achieve? As far as its impact on accountability is concerned, we agree that protests helped increase the political salience of electricity supply because of broad-based mobilizations. Everyone was impacted. That's partly why we saw so many protests taking place. Electricity supply became an electoral issue, which is why the 2013 election results came out the way that they did. There was a high degree of media focus. Popular cultural representation also enhanced salience, and that produces questions of who does the media actually speak for. But electricity pricing and subsidy reform is still not a major arena for contention and accountability. We still see gradual hikes taking place under IMF-led stabilization programs. There's still an ongoing conversation of making electricity more expensive so that we get closer to the market price of how much we're producing it for as well. So what we see is that there were no lasting efforts to make policy processes on energy more inclusive. The reform orientation is still geared towards deregulation and privatization. I'm not necessarily saying that this isn't a solution here, but the fact of the matter is that this remains the dominant approach towards understanding the electricity sector as it exists. So we have very little evidence that the episodes of contention between 2008 and 15 had positive spillovers for accountability, not just in electricity, but also in other services. When we look at the impact on empowerment, what we see are that pre-existing networks, especially for privileged populations, were at the heart of energy struggles, trade associations, political elites, and their clients. Low-income groups utilized community-based ties with field-level state officials for short-term relief, but were not unable to gather enough voice at higher levels of decision-making. So what we see is that who got heard was contingent on pre-existing networks and political/electoral salience. Post-crisis, there was no successful mobilization on energy issues facing non-elite groups, in particular issues around pricing and sustainable infrastructure. And we can't say that this period of contention that exists between 2007 to 2015 leads to any greater control or greater voice for citizens as far as decision-making as far as decision-making structures are concerned. The last point that I wanted to raise here is regarding the insularity of transnational actors, which is also partly why we see some of the unresponsiveness as far as Pakistan's electricity sector is concerned. In Pakistan's case, donors, foreign capital play an immense role in shaping the energy landscape. And as Islal's work points out, reform processes are oftentimes conceived of as highly technocratic interventions, which are led by donor agencies. So in the case of Pakistan, this obviously has implications for who gets to speak and who gets to have their voice incorporated as far as decision-making in the sector is concerned, right? So our conclusion from this research and from the work that we carried out in our other country contexts as well is that the political context matters greatly for accountability. What are some of the pre-existing electoral incentives, the timings and location of protests, which the PMLN in particular was able to capitalize on through anti-government sentiment in 2013. The existence of the salience of the issue in urban and peri-urban upper income, within a peri-urban and peri-urban upper income groups. Who protests is key. So mobilization from elite actors in particular was able to generate state response on supply, whereas pricing and welfare considerations were not particularly prioritized. Protests tend to build on pre-existing networks, so those groups that are under-organized or unorganized are unlikely to have a lasting impact beyond the protests as well. And what we see is that sustained empowerment as far as localized legacies plus changes in decision-making structures, that remains absent. The electricity sector and decision-making around it looks a lot like it did prior to the protests taking place between 2007 and 2015. So that's pretty much it from mine. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Umair. Let me invite Dr. Asma Faiz to discuss your paper first. Because she has a teaching engagement, so maybe 5 to 7 minutes.
Yes. Thank you, Adeel. Thank you for the invitation also to Econ. Thank you, Umair, for a very interesting paper, as I was telling you when we were walking here, and also, very clear presentation too. I really enjoyed reading the paper. I also really liked, the way you apply the mixed method approach. And it's a very insightful and original data, because wherever you mention the sources of data, but wherever their gaps are, then you go back to Dawn archives, and you even mention how you essentially searched the key terms used and how you were able to pick up, a wide range of protests wherever they took place. I found it interesting also, coming back from the intellectual, area that I work on, which is, ethnic and nationalist movements also, so another type of grassroots mobilization, protest, contention, etc. And that is a different kind of minefield, and hence it generates. So some of my questions are also going to come towards that side, because I see another kind of response from the state when you look at an ethnic claimant or a nationalist, etc. Firstly, I think you said it, or I also might have skipped it in the paper. First was about the original sin, which is what led you to the, or to the project organizers, to the team. Like, how did you decide to compare Nigeria, Mozambique, and Pakistan? You have two African countries, one Pakistan, so maybe you can shed light on this when you are, I can give all the questions. And
go ahead.
So one, I wanted to ask you, if you could just tell us, without knowing anything, I thought perhaps there's a certain similarity in terms of context, in terms of energy shortfall, in terms of public outrage in Nigeria and Mozambique. So Pakistan, how does it fit into, that particular study? So the case selection. This is what I wanted to, ask you. It's very interesting. I totally enjoyed when you write in the paper that electricity is almost part of the social contract. You know, people have inhaled and digested this idea. It's like, you know, roti, kapda, makan. Electricity is also absolutely necessary for the state. It's a fundamental right. And as you say that those who are on the supply side of it, they don't think. They say it's just one of the things that we have to do. It's not a fundamental right. I wanted to ask you that if we were to change context a little bit, and if we were, let's say, these protests were happening in urban Sindh, because PPP was in power in federation, and then PPP was in power at the province also. So would we expect, you know, hypothetically, intuitively, a different kind of reaction of local government? Because then that would mean that perhaps the repression would increase, because they wouldn't want to be exposed on their own home turf also, essentially. So it was convenient, because when I was reading this paper, I remembered, you know, those images of Shahbaz Sharif going to Minar Pakistan, pankhi jhal rahe hain, and saying कि बिजली नहीं आ रही है, गर्मी बहुत ज़्यादा है. Of course, this was the political capital for them, because you're showing the inefficiency of PPP.
Yeah.
But what if this is happening, and maybe in your dawn, search, you would have come across energy protests in Sindh. So would we expect, you know, party politics is a defining variable here in terms of state's response or local administration's response. So it's my opposition party in government, let me name and shame them. It is my own party. I would not allow this protest to come to public, or would be more repressive towards the protesters. So the role of party politics in it. I had missed out the point of role of media, but when I was reading this paper, I was thinking, like you have good Taliban and bad Taliban, you have good issues and you have bad issues. So I was thinking about issues on which, for example, PTM protests, or the issues over which Baloch protests. Sure. So the issue that no one should be discussing, like the missing persons also. They continue to sit, they sit in front of, they do sit-ins. There is a 4,000-day-old sit-in in front of Quetta Press Club. Media does not broadcast it. State either represses them, immediately arrests them, or pretend that they are not sitting. So if we were, operationalizing this project, we would think that what is the issue at hand, as in some issues are no-go areas in Pakistan. So if all other things are equal, all the other factors are there, just the nature of issue at hand, an issue in which you're criticizing the role of the deep state in maybe rigging an election, an issue of missing person, like Amna Janjua has been looking for her husband for 17 years. She goes and sits in front of Islamabad Press Club. I mean, nobody gives coverage, या उनको मार के उठा देते हैं. So it is the issue also. So party politics अपनी जगह, state की जो है, you know, social contract की definition or redefinition अपनी जगह, but it's also the issue. Some issues are allowed in this particular context. Some are halal issues over which you can go and protest. Other issues are not halal. You can't protest. If you protest about them, you either disappear or you're not just, you know, given coverage. There is a complete media black hole over those issues. So if you could talk about the nature of issues and how could you perhaps reconceptualize this if it was a different issue, you know, at hand. I was also thinking about how you mentioned the organizational strength, mobilization network, grassroots structure of these parties. Does it matter if they have support, that these citizens groups or professional associations have support from mainstream parties? They go and they protest, and mainstream parties are ready to pick up on this issue. Again, I was thinking of, you know, Naqibullah Mahsood's killing in Karachi. Mainstream political parties did not want to really sit and complain about, you know, Rao Anwar, because Rao Anwar was connected to, you know, Rangers and all of that. How important is the alliance of these citizens groups or professional associations with mainstream parties? Can mainstream parties help them to channel this anger, or mainstream parties are just a secondary agent or agency in this regard? If you could, you know, elaborate on this. I just have to say one small thing. So Sultan, I have absolutely, there is no quantitative cell in my brain. I don't understand as much as I try. It's only a qualitative brain. So I didn't understand the research design, but the conclusions that you were saying, it was just out of curiosity. You showed that PPP, it was an association or signing an NRO, taking an NRO with Musharraf was a handicap for them. But it's also because at that time the lawyers' movement was there. Because if we go back to 2018, as long as you had a halal deal with the establishment, you were sure to win elections. If you look at new media coverage, June, July 2018, etc. So I mean, how would you if you so that means that lawyers movement or 2008 is a particular phenomenon, because your observation would be completely reversed in 2018 elections also. It was an advantage to have the generals on your back and a disadvantage to have generals against you, as is shown by the party. So how would you say to that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I've been assigned the responsibility of discussing Sultan's paper. So very briefly, and I have to keep a watch to myself. Basically, in the decade of 2000s, you had the fall of Musharraf, and that was precipitated by the lawyers' movement. And we know that that had different political effects in terms of political parties. PMLN allied with the lawyers' movement and was a beneficiary in key constituencies. So what Sultan is effectively doing is providing some empirical meat on some of these facts and allowing us to understand better what led to the fall of Musharraf's movement, what role was did the social movement in the guise of lawyers' movement played in that process, and what were the political winners and losers. You are essentially leveraging the visits of the Chief Justice, what you describe as incidental visits, visits that were not planned, versus visits that were planned, and use that as an identification strategy to explore your main question. Now, because this is a very early stage project and you don't have a paper at hand, my comments really emanate from the presentation slides that you've shared with me earlier. I have three main comments. One is really a better elaboration of what is incidental. There wasn't much discussion about it. I mean, clearly there is a path that the Chief Justice is following, and there are certain towns that were advertised already, and the Chief Justice is going to end up there, but there are some towns that fall on the way. Now, are these incidental visits those that are not advertised in the media, or maybe they were already known to the Chief Justice's travel party, but they were not advertised because they're very small towns. And so they want to really advertise the likes of, Sakkar, Tata, etc. And there are a lot of small towns that are part of the itinerary, but they're not necessarily advertised. So obviously, there's a lot more elaboration needed on that. The second point is obviously about a lot of other factors that are relevant here, and some of which you've recognized. Now, both the success of the lawyers' movement, where it was more successful, and its after effects were shaped by a number of antecedents that were quite visible in the Musharraf era. One was obviously the growing penetration of the media, and this could vary according to different, districts or tehsils where they were visiting. There was a massive expansion of higher education during that time as well, which obviously could play a part into it. It's also a time when middle class is growing, and again, there's spatial variation in the strength of the middle class. Another very important aspect in the Musharraf era was the road construction. There was massive increase in road construction. So where do you see construction of roads during the Musharraf period could obviously determine where the Chief Justice is going to travel, where some of those middle class communities are likely to be more, likely to be stronger. And it obviously, when I discuss these factors, one paper that's absolutely central for you is by my colleague Neil Ketchley, who published an American Political Science Review, and he looked at the penetration of the Muslim Brotherhood, looking at the railway network in Egypt. And that was very critical for where those branches, Muslim Brotherhood branches, spread out. You can easily find data on where the roads were constructed or where historical road network was available. And obviously, the pre-existing presence of the bars and benches is also very important, because, and that's a point that is also relevant for you, Umair, that the pre-existing mobilization structures are very critical, because their impact could remain latent until it's activated by a shock. The third comment, so apart from these many different factors that might determine, both the visits and the success of the lawyers' movement, is the whole idea about the framing or external validity. And Sultan, in your paper, there are two questions that perhaps lurking in the paper need more clarification. One is obviously you want to explain what precipitates the fall of dictatorship, and then what happens to politics post-political transition, right? And I wonder if you could sort of frame this paper as part of the larger theoretical literature, because if readers everywhere would be interested in asking, why is this an important question? Does it really tell us about how do social movements how are they activated during military rule, and what kind of political after effects they could leave after the transition to authoritarian rule. So what's the big question that you are really trying to tackle is a bit unclear at the moment in the paper. But there's obviously potential in this work. I couldn't stop myself from offering some comments to Umair's very interesting paper as well. I think there's a really interesting literature that exists separately in Middle Eastern studies. One is, electricity and politics of reform is at the heart of it. So you have many contexts like Lebanon, Iraq, again, where electricity infrastructure is hugely fragmented. And you mentioned Nigeria, which again is a classic example. In all of these cases, electricity provision becomes an important political question, and it becomes part of a social contract of the state. What is the state providing? And they're private producers, and in all of these contexts, there are lots and lots of policy reports written by foreign donors. They come with their missions, roll out particular kinds of reform programs. And there's a politics about, there are political elements that are very visible in that process. So I think it would be interesting to see, the question you're exploring has huge external validity. But I wondered, what is the central question around, would it be politics of reform and how that takes place? Obviously, there are interesting parallels with Iraq. I mean, in Iraq, you have, when you look at electricity protests in Iraq in the summer months, they are strongest in Basra. And if you look at the history of the Basra region, this is a place where mobilization structures were already in place. There was a history of protest politics. There was a history of collective mobilization. And so those sort of historical legacy factors exist, and then they're sort of activated around that time. But it's a very important policy issue. So enjoyed interacting with both of those papers. Shall we open up the floor first, or you would like to quickly respond?
Address,
please.
The issues. Thank you, Asma, and obviously Adeel for your comments. Asma, on 4 questions that you raised, I very quickly sort of will go through them one by one. So why were we looking at Pakistan, Nigeria, Mozambique? So the actual pool of countries that we were looking at was much larger, and we have cross-country quantitative work that's come out from the same cohort of researchers that looks at fuel price and energy protests in all countries. So we have a data set for that. But then we had sort of our own area studies, sort of preferences, and that's why sort of we gravitated towards these countries. We also felt that with Pakistan and Nigeria in particular, some of the political context sort of factors, variables were quite similar. But obviously Nigeria, the central focus has been fuel price reform because Nigeria is an oil producer, and there's been a sort of great deal of conversations around the provision of fuel price subsidies for fuel exporting countries in particular. And then in Pakistan, we were looking at electricity and this sort of obviously protests around supply and access and affordability. So that's the first one. The second is the nature of government opposition dynamics. It's a variable that I sort of spent some time in the paper, but I didn't go into much detail as far as the presentation was concerned. It's a very central part of the story. And part of the reason why it comes out very clearly when you look at the data is that a lot of the protests were centered in Punjab. So about 65 to 70% of the protests take place in Punjab. Punjab was also worse hit as far as the electricity crisis was concerned. So the duration of outages was higher in Punjab
than all the
other provinces. Part of it had to do with the 18th Amendment and the rights of resource use in those particular areas. And so and this was also a grievance that was mobilized, not weaponized, by the PMLN in 2013 when the talk was about Punjab getting an unfair deal as far as the provision of electricity was concerned. Because Punjab provincial government was with the PMLN, the protests were allowed to fester for much longer. Local administration was very reluctant. I did interviews with deputy commissioners in a number of districts, including in Toba Tek Singh. And the rioting that happened at Riaz Fatiana's house, where 3 people were killed, it was allowed to sort of continue because it had political salience for the party. And so one of the points that I mentioned, that within the political context, the nature of government-opposition relations, as well as how power is structured institutionally, has a great deal of impact in what protests become salient and how far they're sort of obviously allowed to evolve. On the third point that you raised, which is this distinction between halal versus haram issues and coverage as far as the media is concerned, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are issues of basic rights around citizenship. Which
right to life seems more important
exactly.
than right to electricity.
Right, and those rights and the way that those rights are framed,
yes.
in particular, where they challenge central authority of the state in particular, they become issues, they become bad issues, whereas issues which have cross-sectional appeal, which are in particular perpetuated by elites in all 4 federating units, as well as elites that are already part of the decision-making structure, they tend to be portrayed in the media in a different way as well. I'm sure there's a good empirical, quantitative way of capturing this reality, but it's something that does come out sort of quite clearly when you look at this particular issue, as opposed to, say, ethnic mobilization or mobilization of ethnic grievances, as was the case in the PTM mobilization as well. And then finally, the fourth point, which was the nature of party linkages with professional associations, is another central key point, which I think also goes back to what Adeel, you mentioned, who has the pre-existing latent capacity to protest. In my view, and the data that we collected, it's very clear that there are middle class and upper income groups that already have the ability to mobilize, and these mobilizations then become salient when a major crisis such as the electricity crisis, for example, comes out into play. So the fact that it was trade associations, chambers of commerce, elite organizations like the Pakistan Business Council that were at the forefront of lobbying for improvements in supply, greater investment in electricity generation, that just shows that, again, the pre-existing structure of civil society and their relations with political parties matters most. And that also explains why issues of affordability and sustainability, which are, again, issues that confront low-income, disempowered groups, are not given as much attention as far as policy discourse was concerned, as far as in this particular time period that we're looking at. So thank you again for those comments. Those are very helpful, and I'll certainly keep them in mind when I'm redrafting the paper. Just very quickly on Adeel, your comment regarding sort of the way that this can be looked at across the Middle East in particular. Yes, that is certainly something that we've done for one of the papers that we were looking at. And I think the nature of who gets heard is a central question, and it goes beyond just electricity. It goes into sort of every aspect of service delivery, but also on basic issues of citizenship in particular. But obviously the parallels with Middle Eastern politics in particular, especially with legacies of authoritarian rule and the nature of state civil society relations, I think they become quite central in all of these places. So thank you once again for bringing attention to that. And yeah, so that's pretty much it.
Thank you very much, Sultan.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So, thanks, Adeel, for discussing the paper. It's an honor to be discussed, and yeah, thanks for the feedback. I think your point about elaborating more incidental versus non-incidental is well taken, and this was I was just very excited to present it to a Pakistani audience. That's why this is not written down yet, so that this is very timely. Just a few comments. So I did stop short on purpose of defining this paper as like how to bring down dictatorship in the world. I think it's very specific, and that's why, and actually it relates to your other points. I think this paper is about a specific time period in a specific country, and its interest actually arises, still I think it's a big question, even when we kind of think that why did it bring down General Musharraf, who seemed very invincible. And of course, there are mediating factors which this lawyers movement enhances or depreciates. So for example, we are thinking actually, so I skipped a slide which actually looks at the role of media. And there is a strong prior that media was a complement in this. So the rise of media and the lawyers movement at the same time, I think supercharged the lawyers movement. And also there is an effect like you have very nicely alluded to, is like the new media freedom, it was, and versus old media freedom probably has a different effect. So in 2018, maybe media is not as credible as it once was, because of all sorts of propaganda apparatus, etc. So the way I think about all of these factors which you matter, for example, a network of bar associations, I think these are prerequisites for such a movement to happen. And all of these factors basically mediate the effect of the lawyers movement on the support for parties which allied with General Musharraf. So that's my general take on your comments. Thanks.
Great. Let's open up the floor for discussion. Any questions?
Yes. Yes.
Dr. Yasir Khan here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very fascinating discussion and sort of an interdisciplinary approach to protests and social issues. My questions are for Sultan, and I have two questions. So the first one is, and I may be completely wrong, so please do correct me, but I think that at the time of the fall of General Musharraf in 2008 elections, there was an exodus from PMLQ of candidates who were sort of electable. And I'm just wondering if you have had a chance to see sort of heterogeneity of your results in which you show the vote share of PMLN rises and PPP goes down, if it has something to do with the electability of the candidates. So that's the first one. The second question is, you motivated your presentation with what led to the fall of General Musharraf, and one of the episodes that you showed was the Lal Masjid episode. And I'm just wondering if you have had a chance to actually explore that channel, which may have led to the fall of General Musharraf, and if you have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll collect two more. Dr. Akbar Zaidi. Here.
So I think, Umair, I think there's far more interesting stuff than you've presented from the work that you're doing, which you've alluded to. And I think I'll be more interested in that, about elite capture of social movements, about collective action issues, which you've alluded to in your answer. But there's one thing which you sort of presented, and the answer to that is already found in your research. You said, why isn't affordability an issue? You raised that question, but that's answered by the fact that those groups who were actually, asking for electricity didn't really care. Affordability is not an issue; it's supply. बिजली आनी चाहिए, पैसे की बात में फिक्र करेंगे. So that also has implications on sort of how far does this fall in terms of. So you've got electricity, you've got costly electricity. So how does that pan out in terms of social distribution? Equity issues. Not that you're looking at that, but I think that's something interesting that also comes out, that, okay, we'll give you electricity, we'll raise the price by 7 rupees a unit, and now you see how are you going to deal with this? How do those people who are getting some electricity affected by it? So I think there's lots of very interesting things that you're talking about, which you can expand on and write separate papers on, many papers on this.
Great. There's a question here, gentleman in red shirt.
Thank you so much. Aftab here from ITU. Sorry. Thank you for both very good presentations. Sultan, I have just one question from you. It's a methodological one. The way you present, it looks like a causal analysis. And coming from a sociology background, I always refrain from sort of making, either it's a correlational analysis or a causational analysis. Please elaborate on that. Because it looks like, as has been mentioned also, that what if the CJ visits were not really, they were prompted by already existing capital in those areas of bar associations and others. So I'm sort of interested in that, and in a larger picture, which Dr. Adeel has already mentioned, new social movement theory, Maluchi's work or Turin's work, they extensively explore how these movements or their dynamics pan out. So maybe an elaboration, if you're looking into that, how do you situate it? Umair, thank you so much. As Dr. Zaidi said, excellent work. Just two things. So when we look at the rights debate, are you situating it mainstream development discourse of rights, or are you looking more into Sand's entitlement theory? Where do you find this rights debate? Secondly, if I understood correctly, sociologically speaking, that whole discourse of that electricity tumhara hak hai is also has some sort of underpinnings within the political discourse. So as you rightly pointed out, कि Punjab में शायद इसलिए था because they wanted to sort of build that capital. And I guess that's where the fissure becomes clear, that they sort of propagated that discourse, it became a popular slogan, and now that technically we are trying to understand it. Rather important, in my case, important point, in Vision 2030, we are talking about ICTs, moving towards knowledge economy. So on some meta level, there is this push for ICT development and all those knowledge economy things, which inevitably requires electricity. And so how do you situate the debate within those frameworks? Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll take these questions and then have another round.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So thank you, everybody, for the questions. I think I have written them down, but that doesn't have any effect because I can never recognize my handwriting. So yeah, that's a lost cause. But yeah, so I will answer the question which I remember the most. Yeah, so is it causal or is it correlational? And I'm going to be a clever economist and going to dodge this very strategically by saying it's quasi-causal. And so first of all, let me unpack this. So first of all, it's so this methodology I use are grouped up in economics methods which are called quasi-experimental. And it's not a full randomized control trial where we basically give a placebo and a treatment to somebody and see the effect. So what I do, and that's I think I do a lot of randomized experiments too, and I think that they are difficult and easy at the same time. So the way I see it is like it's to go back in history, look at the data, and try to trace. Can we say something beyond correlation? That's like the thing. So you are precisely and extremely accurate that the Chief Justice visited districts where they had the political capital and didn't visit that districts where he didn't. So to make progress towards more causality, I need Chief Justice to flip a coin and say I'm going to visit a district which might have no political capital, and then not visit a district which he has political capital. So I can't go back in history and make Chief Justice do that, but what I can do is I can look at those places where Chief Justice went, where he just went because it was in the way. And that's what I do. So basically I say, now Adeel Saab has made a good point that, maybe the by the way visits are not by the way as well. And that's something which we acknowledge. But, looking at history, I'm hoping that by doing this, maybe I can do better. So one thing I do to, say, reduce or mitigate, not eliminate, mitigate this concern, is look at what happened if the Chief Justice, for example, went to districts where PMLQ was already doing very bad, or something like that. We should also observe a similar effect of CJ visit before the lawyers' movement. And so basically what we find is that the incidental visits are not basically, is not all driving the results before the lawyers' movement happened, suggesting that they are not going to their power centers of, say, PMLN or PMLQ. So that's one thing I do. Second thing I do is also I look at incomes of people, incidental visits, and look at, using the household survey, the PSLM, look whether the incomes of people are higher in those areas where he went incidentally, and versus he went non-incidentally. When we look at non-incidental visits, we precisely find what you think. Those are more richer places. They have higher income. It's a strategic political capital. But incidental, the incomes are similar, which kind of allows us to think, okay, there are many things we observe which are similar in incidental visits and incidental non-visits. And then we are kind of taking a leap of faith by saying that things we are not observing, like something which is a deep factor of political capital, is something which is also randomly distributed across the treatment and control group. So you have to rely on a bunch of assumptions, and the important point is to list the assumptions and try to talk to as much assumptions as you can. So that's my...
If I could just remind you Yasser's 2 questions.
No, I remember now.
Okay,
Because it's,
great.
while I was talking, I remembered, yeah. Yeah, so there are 2 Yasser. So one Yasser question. I think I spoke too soon, so you can remind
so
me.
it's PMLQ. There were a lot of party switching, right?
Yeah.
And then the Lal Masjid.
Yeah, Lal Masjid, yeah. So, okay, great. So, so we are actually looking at data set which Umair is looking at the Dawn News archives and try to see whether the Lal Masjid how did that mediate the effect. It could be the case, it could go either way. Lal Masjid could crowd out the effect, or it could even crowd in the effect, meaning that people who were exposed to the Lal Masjid were affected by the lawyers movement even more. So a lot of things can happen, and I think our strategy is to look at the news reports of basically the Lal Masjid and how this affects the movement. But there are the electables is an interesting source of heterogeneity, and this is something which I have explored. And what it turns out to be that electables are going there because of the popularity, right? If we look at opinion polls, we find that electables go there after they find that Musharraf has become a liability, or the party has become a liability. Even like Sheikh Rashid, right? Like he says that when he went to when he went to ask for votes for the PMLQ, they said, please don't come. All his people said, please don't come and ask for it. So there is a media clip from him as well. So these are all sources of heterogeneity which I think are yet to be explored in this paper. Yeah.
Great. Umair.
Thank you very much. I'll quickly, Aftab, thank you for your comments. On the rights thing, I haven't framed this myself. I'm using the language that people I interviewed and spent time with were communicating. So it's, for them, it's an entitlement. The language is of entitlement, that this is something that, we have a contract, there's a moral contract with the state for, and it is the moral obligation of the state to provide us. Again, long tradition of looking at sort of, the price of bread, for example, the price of roti. These have been studied. Electricity has not been studied in the same framework, but I think there is increasingly a focus on looking at energy in the same way that citizens think that it is a non-negotiable aspect of their relationship with the state. And the question that sort of the follow-up on that, which you mentioned, that this is cultivated. This idea of a moral obligation is cultivated, but it's not cultivated in the period that I'm looking at. It certainly is echoed in that period, but the cultivation of this idea कि ये आपका हक है happens much before that. And it happens in, post-colonial एक जो legacy है state building की, उसके साथ ये बहुत intrinsically tied है कि what is the purpose of decolonization? The purpose is to, bring you up to the same level that the colonizers were at, right? So you build dams, you build electricity infrastructure. Look at the early imagery of Wabda from the 1960s and 70s. It is all about this idea of nation building, right? And so, Liz Chatterjee has this great paper on sort of fossil developmentalism in the global south, where she argues essentially that this is what states were promising their citizens, and now that promise has been imbibed. So when the state fails to do it is when you see 456 protests taking place between 2007 and 2015, right? So I think that's the origin of it, and yes, it is reinforced repeatedly by political discourse on that. Dr. Zaidi, thank you once again. आपके मुंह में घी शक्कर कई पेपर निकले लेकिन पहले एक निकला है वही बहुत होगा. I think you're absolutely right that the answer, I mean, this was what the sort of the narrative that I'm building in the paper as well, that part of the reason why certain things are prioritized over others is precisely because of the latent mobilization capacity of some groups over compared to others, right? And this is a fairly sort of, it's a commonplace finding as far as social movement theory is concerned. But again, it's for electricity and for looking at energy as a way of studying state-society relations. This hasn't been sort of looked at in the same detail. And I think in the case of Pakistan, where we don't really understand what the civil society landscape looks like as far as protest is concerned. I know we looked at, sort of the lawyers movement has given us good empirical material to study, but I feel like these prolonged incidents of protests and contention also give us some insight into who can mobilize, whose voice gets heard, and what is the impact of protests that, that have taken place over this particular time period. So yes, thank you once again for that.
Great. We can have another round, a final round. We have 8 minutes. Yes, so maybe we could start with the lady here.
Again, thank you for interesting papers and interesting comments. So I just wanted to pick up from what Professor Zadi said, and just as you were sort of talking about electricity, I started thinking about what's going on in the last couple of years and sort of putting it in this broader context again of really macro level state-society relationship. And in that, sort of here you have one instance of a state now trying to at least deliver a certain basic service, right, whatever you want to say, to society. But in the way that it ends up delivering that, in fact, creates further really difficult dynamics in which you sort of, you can say neoliberal or sort of privatized kind of a solution to it. But as a result, you end up creating further difficulties in terms of this whole issue of circular debt and what IMF has now been forcing the state to do in Pakistan, and the state is resisting, but it seems like it's in this tremendous bind because at some point it has to give in. And at the same time, all of that dynamic and increasing debt burden of the state is creating such a difficult situation for ordinary citizens. So this kind of a, loop or dynamic that actually ends up creating further separation, division, suspicion, contention between state and society. So that's sort of.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other question? Yeah, Dr. Faiz here.
Yes, please.
Thank you. My first question is from Sultan. I was wondering that what is the channels through which a CJ visit has transferred to the increase in the female in visit? And the second is about, it was the time, 2007, it was the time when law and order situation was starting to deteriorate in Pakistan. So I was wondering that did you control for the law and order situation in the form of like number of terrorist attacks in your districts or kidnapping or any other variable? And you can also use Umair variable at the district level, energy related, right? Because it was also the time when energy crises have increased. And my another question is from Umair is about that you have extracted data from the DAN. I'm wondering then that DAN, there is a very less probability that DAN will report a protest, energy-related protest in a district like FATA, ex-FATA, or KP or Balochistan. So why didn't you use the local newspaper to extract data?
So,
okay,
yeah.
so
Sorry.
we'll just have another question and
Sure.
then I'll come back to you. A question here in the front row.
My name is Muin Afzal. I'm with Ideas at present is on the board. But as someone who was associated in the first 3 years of Musharraf's government, I was very much interested in hearing your comments, Dr. Sultan. You mentioned the Chief Justice's movement and the Lal Masjid. But I recall that, two other underlying factors like high inflation, like power shortages. But I just wanted to put a sort of question to you. Is it not if you look at it historically, is it not very much the same old story of there being a desire for change in Pakistan, perhaps sooner than in many other countries. Normally they say, you know, the electorate wants to change after 5 years or 10 years in Britain and so on. But here it's always come earlier. And, you know, my reaction was that, look, Musharraf came in and stayed for, what, 9 years? Which was perhaps longer than many others have, even politically, democratically elected ones. And therefore, in fact, he outstayed his welcome. And had it not been for the lawyers' movement, you know, maybe there was a desire for change. And the point you made about PMLQ people going to the other side, we are seeing a bit of that now. You know, that does happen. But for factors, some underlying factors and the desire for change and perhaps the electorate's feeling of frustration when a lot of expectations are not fulfilled. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Sultan, maybe you could start.
Thank you. That's a really nice question. So, of course, there are many factors, and I think one factor which I didn't deeply think about is the fatigue effect, which you basically have mentioned. And is it just like and it makes me think that whether we should have a 5-year term to start with. Yeah, so that's a very insightful observation. Just to kind of, my method is basically exploiting the variation within Pakistan. So the fatigue, for our fatigue to drive the results, we would need the CJ incidental visits he went on the way, and where he didn't go on the way, those districts will need to have more and less fatigue strategically correlated with them. So this fatigue effect, the effect of just other factors need to be correlated with the CJ visit, because we are not just looking at a before-after comparison where we see lawyers' movement. So I showed you this effect of this General Musharraf 60% popularity and then 15% popularity. I am saying that, okay, a lot of things happen, and these factors which you mentioned are definitely happening. What I'm saying is the part of this fall is also due to the lawyers' movement, and to disentangle this, I look at the visits of Chief Justice, taking into account the global effect. So we kind of have a what in empirics is called a time-fixed effect, which basically captures macroeconomic factors like things which were changing in that year. So we are looking at things which happened beyond that macroeconomic factor. Some additional fall that happened immediately after the Chief Justice visited. So that's the method which we are using to try to disentangle this. That being said, it's not an experiment. And I am happy to admit alternative explanations which might drive the results. Yeah. So the second question of Faiz was the channels which drive these results. And I think this is precisely why the paper is not written yet, is because I want to get deep into the channels to understand these results. So one channel which I had in mind, and I think it's still here, but in the slides I presented, I cut. I think my prior is agenda setting. So there is this agenda setting, which we are using manifestos. But for example, if you look at the PMLN manifesto, they have like 1/3 of their manifesto is about the lawyers' movement. Whereas the PPP mentions rule of law and general stuff, which was always there. So the shift, the agenda they set. Also the PMLN did this halaf, right? Like Nawaz Sharif called them wada karo, that you will restore Chief Justice, and it was a costly signal in front of the electorate that he could have said it in closed doors, but he kind of did a commitment device where you had to this. And then the second mechanism is the media. And that's something which is also has to be explored. And then we have to decompose the effect driven by media, agenda setting, and see what is actually driving the mechanism of the results.
Great, Umair, very quickly, 2 minutes.
Very quickly, Professor Farad's comment where the state, in an attempt to solve the crisis, exacerbates the crisis. I think that's a great summation of what the problem is. I think, again, I make no sort of claims as to what the solution to the crisis is, I mean, there is a healthy debate on the level of deregulation that is required. Privatization effects. I know Ijlal yesterday also discussed the K-electric experiment and how it's, it is proving to have some positive, outcomes as far as Karachi is concerned. And so I think there is certainly a lot of scope for all of that in the conversation on how do you provide this service to citizens. But part of it also has to do with the decision-making structures in terms of, how are these decisions being made? Are they completely being made? Is it a purely technical domain in which, someone gives a policy report and just says, this needs to be implemented? Or is it supposed to come out of the political process in some ways? And what we're seeing is that what's coming out of the political process prioritizes certain things to the detriment of perhaps other things, right? And I think for me, that requires a political explanation or a political economy explanation for why, that is the outcome. To Dr. Faiz's point about the availability of, you're absolutely right. We were operating under a resource constraint at the time. So we could only look at the archives that were readily available, and we looked at some existing data sets as well. But one thing that we did do was that for a section of the archive that we had, we did a background check for looking at Urdu newspapers that were more heavily reporting from districts. And what we realized was that there was very little slippage between the two. Mostly the incidents were being covered in the editions that we were also looking at from Dawn. It was only where the incidents were of below a certain threshold that they were not being picked up by the English language press. But if once I have more resources for this, it is certainly something that I would want to do because it will help us, again, have a more sort of expansive coverage of the universe of protests that took place around this time. So yes, thank you for that. The point is obviously well taken.
Well, that brings us to the close of this session. We have another 25 minutes before the next session starts. We have a tea break. But before I close the session, please join me in thanking Umair and Sultan for two very interesting presentations.